describing the entire history of Moscow's dominance of Azerbaijan since the Bolshevik Revolution in the terms that President Aliyev did is to change not just the narrative. His father never said.
President Ilham Aliyev, in his interview with Arabiya, said that Russian Bolsheviks not only granted independence to Azerbaijan, but interrupted Azerbaijan's independence. This change of official narrative, how significant is it?
I think it's the most significant statement that President Aliyev has made in his presidency. I think that this is a signal that Azerbaijan is no longer going to be led by the nose by the Russians. All the criticism about the shooting down of the airplane, about the killing of Azerbaijani activists in the Russian Federation, those are issues that can be dealt with. What President Aliyev did in his Al Arabiya interview was to simply announce the Russians have been our opponents since day one. And it's not unimportant that Russian commentaries are outraged. One commentary I read yesterday said there's not a single positive word in Mr. Aliyev's remarks about Russia, not one, that it's all criticism. I think that is a fundamental change in where Baku is. I think it's not something that it would be easy for President Aliyev to walk back from. I think it presages a radical shift in the power relations in the South Caucasus. And while it didn't get much attention, Iranian officials said they were no longer confident that the Russians were on their side, that they didn't feel that the grand partnership that Mr. Putin has talked about existed, that Russia was prepared to help Iran. So and with respect to Armenia, you see people calling for the closure of the Russian base at Gumri. You see Armenia increasingly looking to Europe. It's probably too extreme to say, as some Russians are, that Moscow has lost the South Caucasus. But it is certainly true that today, thanks to statements by the president of Azerbaijan, by senior officials in Tehran, and by the Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan of Armenia, that we are in a new reality. And it's one in which Russia can no longer assume that it will always be the deciding factor in what goes on. My guess is that in the short term, this will lead to Russian efforts to destabilize the situation in one or more of these countries. I don't expect a military action. Russia is too overextended right now in Ukraine. Pulling forces out of Ukraine, which would be necessary to move against Azerbaijan or Armenia, isn't in the cards. And I think that the Russians are going to have to come to terms with the fact that 34 years after the Soviet Union disintegrated, they are now dealing with two very independent countries that they can't play against each other. The Russian playbook, if you will, for dealing with the South Caucasus is when you were having problems with Azerbaijan, you warmed up to Armenia. When you were having problems with Armenia, you warmed up to Azerbaijan. The fact is, we're now in a situation where Armenia and Azerbaijan both see Russia as the problem rather than the solution, and Russian efforts, especially by Foreign Minister Lavrov, to bring in the Iranians as a factor that would help Russia, have failed. Now, is that forever? Probably not. But is it a new world? I urge everyone who hasn't done it yet to read carefully President Aliyev's statement to Al Arabiya. It is an amazing statement, and it is one that I think will define much of how Azerbaijan behaves in the coming months. And it is one that will be remembered as a turning point, one that opens the door to Azerbaijan being far more an independent actor than it's ever been before since 1991.
But at the same time, we're seeing Azerbaijan-Russia economic consultations going on. For instance, in Astrakhan, they were discussing expanding energy cooperation.
That's right. Of course, Baku is going to talk to Moscow about energy cooperation and trade. Of course. But the difference is that it isn't Moscow that's setting the agenda of those talks, it's Azerbaijan. You can still talk to people after you've changed your position, but it changes the way those talks. I am quite sure that the conversations that have taken place in Astrakhan now are very, very different than the ones that took place 3 or 6 months ago. I think Azerbaijan is saying, this is what we want, this is what we will insist upon, rather than having Moscow say, this is what we want and what we will insist upon. Azerbaijani president's interview shows that he and his government are not prepared any longer to accept Moscow's diktat, and that Moscow does not have the leverage it had in the past. That being the case, of course you'll continue to talk. That's a given in international affairs. People are always talking to one another. But I don't see that changing or even limiting the kind of uh, indication that the balance of power in the South Caucasus has changed. Azerbaijan is in a much more powerful position now than it was a year ago. And I think Moscow knows it. It's one of the reasons, probably, that you didn't see the kind of outrage by the Russian foreign minister or Putin himself to what President Aliyev said, because what President Aliyev said is an indictment of Moscow's approach to the South Caucasus in general and to Azerbaijan in particular since 1917. And that is an amazing thing. I was surprised, quite frankly, that President Aliyev was as tough-minded as he was in bringing up issues about borders, bringing up issues about trade, bringing up issues of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and pointing to Russia as the problem, that Moscow has been the problem. That's a very different kind of language. And it's the kind of language that you can't walk away from the way you could walk away from, was the Azal shoot down an accident or not? Saying it was an accident, okay, fine. It was an accident that came out of a Russian gun. Saying that it was unfortunate that Azerbaijani activists were killed in the Urals, fine. You can deal with that. But describing the entire history of Moscow's dominance of Azerbaijan since the Bolshevik Revolution in the terms that President Aliyev did is to change not just the narrative, but the way in which people will calculate what they do next. I suspect there are an awful lot of people in Moscow who really do believe that Moscow has lost the South Caucasus. Again, I would not use that vocabulary because I don't think the South Caucasus was quite Moscow's to lose. But the balance of power today, thanks to the Al Arabiya interview and what has taken place that has driven President Aliyev to say those things, which I would point out his father never said. So I think you have to realize this is a turning point. It's the most important thing that President Ilham Aliyev has said about the foreign policy of his country during his presidency.